I've been carrying food across the field to Thomas Calloway for 3 years, ever since his wife passed. Not out of duty, out of the particular care you give someone who's been carrying something heavy alone. He was a quiet man, the kind a hard life makes gentle instead of bitter. On a Tuesday morning, I brought him an apple pie. He took it, looked at me with that rare smile that changed his whole face and said, "You've been good to me, Margaret, better than I deserve." Then he reached into his pocket and held out his late wife's wedding ring, worn smooth by decades of daily wear. "This is the only thing I have left that means anything," his voice rough. "I'd like you to have it, if you'll let me put it on your finger." I stood on that porch with the mountains watching and understood he wasn't just offering a piece of metal. He was offering the last piece of his heart, asking me to turn years of quiet Tuesdays into something permanent. And for the first time in a long time, the answer wasn't complicated. I hadn't always known Thomas Calloway as a man who offered his last treasure on a Tuesday morning. For 3 years, I was just the neighbor who crossed the field with a covered dish, never pushing, never asking. He lived in the old white house at the edge of the valley with the mountains behind him like silent judges. After his wife Anne died, the town said he'd gone quiet for good. But I saw something they didn't. Grief hadn't hardened him. It had worn him down to something honest. The question that hung over every visit was the one neither of us dared speak aloud. Can two people who have learned to live with loss ever risk building something new? I thought I knew the answer, until the day he offered me the only thing he had left, and I realized the story I'd been telling myself was wrong. It didn't begin with the pie. It began with a funeral. The funeral was in late September, the kind of day where the mountains already held the first taste of winter in their peaks. Anne Calloway had been the heart of the valley for 40 years, the woman who organized the church potlucks, who remembered every child's birthday, who could calm a panicked horse with a whisper. Pancreatic cancer took her in 6 months. The whole town came to the service, spilling out of the little white chapel onto the gravel path. I stood near the back, not because I didn't care, but because I'd only lived in the valley for 2 years and I wasn't sure I had the right to grieve openly next to people who'd known her for decades. Thomas Calloway stood at the graveside like a man whose tether to the world had been cut. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stared at the dark rectangle in the earth with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself once, a long time ago. It was the face of someone who had just learned that the future they'd planned would never arrive. The reception afterward was held at the community hall, and I watched women from the church circle around Thomas with covered dishes and careful words. He accepted their food with a nod and set it aside untouched. Nobody seemed to notice that he hadn't eaten in days. That evening, I baked a shepherd's pie. I didn't have a reason except that when my own mother died, the only thing that felt real was the woman who'd shown up with a hot meal and no expectations. I wrapped the dish in a kitchen towel and walked across the field that separated my property from the Calloway farm. It was a half-mile of wild grass and Queen Anne's lace, and by the time I reached his back porch, the pie was still warm. He was sitting in a wooden chair, staring at the darkening mountains. I set the dish on the step and said, "You don't have to talk, just eat." He looked at me then, and for the first time since the service, something flickered behind his eyes. I came back the next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. For 3 years, I crossed that field once a week, rain or shine. In the beginning, I left the food on the porch and walked away. Then one day he was waiting with 2 chairs instead of one, and we sat in silence together. That silence slowly filled with small talk, then real talk, then the kind of comfortable quiet that only exists between people who have both carried something heavy. I learned that he'd built the house with his own hands, that Anne had planted the apple tree by the barn, that their only son had died in a car accident at 19. I told him about my own divorce, about the years I spent in a city where I'd become invisible, about the day I bought my little cottage with the last of my courage and started over. The town noticed, of course. In a place as small as Mill Creek Valley, nothing stays private for long. I'd hear the murmurs at the general store, "She's at his place again. Someone should tell her it's not decent." The church ladies who'd once praised my generosity now looked at me with narrowed eyes. But here's the thing about surviving your own life. Once you've stared down real loneliness, the opinions of busybodies don't carry much weight. And Thomas didn't seem to care either. He'd lost everything that mattered to the judgment of others when Anne died. What remained was a quiet, stubborn dignity that refused to live according to anyone else's schedule. There were moments I almost broke the pattern. A Tuesday in the second year when his hand brushed mine as he took the dish, and neither of us pulled away. An evening in the third year when he showed me the letter Anne had left for him, the one that said, "Don't close your heart forever." I read it standing on his porch while the sunset painted the mountains gold, and felt the weight of a question I was too afraid to ask. But I kept bringing food because it gave me an excuse to see him without having to name what was growing between us. And he kept accepting it because accepting was the only way he knew to begin opening a door that grief had slammed shut. That Tuesday morning in early October, I woke up knowing something had shifted. I can't explain it rationally. Maybe it was the quality of the light, or the dream I had about Anne smiling at me from across a field. I baked an apple pie from the last of the season's fruit, the recipe my grandmother swore was good enough to mend any broken thing. I wrapped it in a checkered cloth and started across the field, the same route I'd walked over 100 times by then. The grass was damp with dew, and the mountain stood sharp against a pale blue sky. I remember thinking that the path between our houses had worn a visible line through the meadow, like the earth itself had accepted the routine. He was on the porch already, sitting in the same wooden chair where I'd first seen him on the evening of the funeral. But something was different. He'd shaved. He was wearing a clean shirt. His hands were folded in his lap, and he looked at me as I came up the steps with an expression I'd never seen before, part nervous, part resolute, the face of a man about to step off the edge of something he couldn't take back. I handed him the pie, and he took it with both hands, his rough fingers brushing my wrist and staying there a moment too long. "You've been good to me, Margaret," he said, his voice thick with the effort of words he'd rehearsed. "Better than I deserve." I started to say something automatic, some deflection about neighborly duty, but he shook his head and I fell silent. Then he did something that stopped my breath. He reached into the pocket of his clean shirt and pulled out a ring, a thin gold band, worn so smooth by years of daily wear that it felt soft even from where I stood. It was Anne's wedding ring. I'd seen it on her finger at church a handful of times before she got sick, a simple circle that had circled the sun with her for 43 years. "This is the only thing I have left that means anything," he said, his voice rougher now, like the words had to fight their way through decades of silence. "I'd like you to have it, if you'll let me put it on your finger." I stood on that porch with the mountains watching and the pie cooling in his hands, and for the first time in 3 years I had no words. Years of quiet Tuesdays, of unspoken feelings and careful distances, all compressed into a single impossible question. He wasn't offering me a piece of metal. He was offering me the last piece of his heart, the part he'd been guarding since the day the earth closed over the woman he'd loved since he was 18 years old. And he was asking me to decide, right there on that worn wooden porch, whether I was ready to step out of the safety of routine and into something that could break us both. I opened my mouth to answer, and what came out of my mouth wasn't the careful, measured response I'd always imagined. It was simply, yes. The word hung in the mountain air like a bell that had been waiting years to ring. Thomas's hand trembled just once, this man who'd weathered decades of farm work without flinching, and then his rough fingers were sliding Anne's ring onto my left hand. It was warm from being held in his pocket, warm like it had been waiting too. The fit was almost perfect, just a little loose, as if the gold itself was making room for a different life. I didn't cry. I'd expected to, but in that moment the only thing I felt was a strange, quiet certainty. Like every Tuesday walk across that field, every dish I'd left on his porch, every hour of shared silence had been leading exactly here. Thomas set the pie down on the railing and took both my hands in his. "I'm not asking you to replace her," he said, his voice steadier now that the hard part was done. "Anne was Anne. You're you. What I'm asking is whether you'll write a new chapter with me, one that doesn't erase the old one, just adds to it." I told him I understood. I told him I'd been writing that chapter for 3 years without admitting it to myself. And then, Because the moment was too big for a porch, we went inside and I made coffee in the kitchen where I'd once only dropped off meals. We sat at the wooden table that had seen 40 years of family dinners and we talked, really talked for the first time about what a future together might look like. It wasn't a fairy tale. We were both past 60, carrying the scars of loss and the baggage of a lifetime. But sitting there with the morning light coming through the window and the ring on my finger, it felt possible. The trouble started, as trouble often does in small towns, with a single overheard conversation. 3 days after Thomas proposed, I was at the general store picking up flour and sugar. Mrs. Hattie Kirkland, the postmistress and the town's most efficient distributor of gossip, was talking to the butcher in a low voice that was perfectly calculated to carry across the cold case. "Well, she finally got what she was after," Hattie said, loud enough for me to hear. "3 years of bringing that poor man casseroles, and now she's got his ring. My Herald says the Callaway place is worth a good 300,000, free and clear. Opportunistic, if you ask me. I didn't turn around. I didn't defend myself. I'd learned long ago that arguing with Hattie Kirkland was like shouting at the wind. It accomplished nothing and left you hoarse. But my hands were shaking as I paid for my groceries, and the shame of being talked about like a fortune hunter in my own community burned hotter than I'd expected. I walked home the long way, avoiding the main road, and by the time I reached my cottage, I talked myself out of telling Thomas about it. He didn't need the burden, but he knew. The next day, when I crossed the field, he was waiting with a grim expression. "Hattie's nephew works for the county land office," he said without preamble. "He came by this morning asking questions about the property line, whether I'd updated my will recently, whether you'd been putting any money into the place." Friendly questions, he called them. Thomas's jaw was tight. I sent him packing, but it started Margaret the talk. I sat down hard in the other chair. "I heard her in the store yesterday. She called me an opportunist." Thomas's hand covered mine on the armrest. "You're not an opportunist. You're the woman who fed me when I couldn't feed myself, who sat with me when I couldn't bear to speak. If anyone in this valley has earned the right to sit on this porch beside me, it's you." His words were fierce, and they should have comforted me completely, but a cold thread of doubt had already wound itself around my heart. A week later, the first letter arrived from a lawyer in the county seat. It was addressed to Thomas but sent in care of the church, a deliberate public move. The letter respectfully requested that Thomas Callaway submit to a medical evaluation to determine his mental fitness, given his recent and questionable decision to become engaged to a woman who had systematically ingratiated herself into his household. The lawyer represented someone named Geraldine Hallbrook. I didn't recognize the name, but Thomas went pale when he read it. "Anne's sister," he said, his voice hollow. "She hasn't spoken to me since the funeral. She wanted Anne's jewelry. I refused. She's been waiting for a reason to make trouble." This was the first real pivot. I'd assumed our only obstacles were internal, our own fears, our own grief. Now I understood that Anne's family saw me as an interloper trying to steal a legacy. Geraldine Hallbrook, I learned, had never liked Thomas. She'd considered him beneath her sister, a farmer with dirt under his nails and no ambition beyond the valley. When Anne died, Geraldine had expected to inherit the few pieces of value: the ring, a pearl necklace, the antique china. Thomas had kept all of it, honoring Anne's wish that her things stay in the home she'd loved. The ring on my finger was the same ring Geraldine believed belonged to her. I told Thomas I would give it back. He refused. "Anne put that ring in my hand the night before she died," he said. "She told me, give it to someone who will wear it with a full heart, not a grasping one. She knew her sister. She also knew you might exist someday." He paused, and his eyes met mine with an intensity that made me forget to breathe. "She knew I might love again. She told me not to be ashamed of it." Anne had seen me. That was the revelation that rearranged everything I thought I knew. During her last months, when I'd been dropping off food as a newcomer to the valley, Anne had watched from the window. She'd told Thomas, according to him, "That woman who brings the shepherd's pie, she crosses the field like she knows what it means to lose someone. Be kind to her, Thomas. She might need you as much as you'll need her." I had no idea. All those Tuesdays, I'd thought I was a stranger offering charity. I'd been seen and named by a dying woman who understood. The letter from Geraldine's lawyer was just the beginning. The following Sunday, I attended church as usual, taking my place in the back pew. Father Michael, a kind man who'd married late in life himself, had been supportive. But when the service ended and I walked to the door, I found Geraldine Hallbrook waiting on the steps. She was tall and expensively dressed, with Anne's same sharp cheekbones but none of her warmth. She blocked my path, and for a moment the whole congregation seemed to hold its breath. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, the title dripping with sarcasm. "Or should I say, the woman who's wearing my sister's ring. I want you to know I'm contesting the estate. That ring is family property, not a trinket to be handed to the first woman who brings a fruit pie. I have a lawyer and I have witnesses who will testify that my brother-in-law hasn't been in his right mind since Anne died." I found my voice, though it came out quieter than I wanted. "Your sister gave the ring to Thomas. She wanted him to be happy. I'm not trying to take anything that doesn't belong to me." Geraldine smiled like a knife. "Happiness. That's a pretty word. We'll let a judge decide what's happiness and what's manipulation. From what I hear, you've been after that farm since the day you moved here. A divorced woman from the city, no roots, no family, suddenly showing up with hot meals. It's a story as old as time." She turned and walked away before I could answer, leaving me shaking on the church steps with the eyes of the whole congregation on me. Father Michael stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "You have friends here, Margaret. Not everyone listens to Hattie Kirkland or Geraldine Hallbrook." But I could feel the doubt spreading like a stain. Some faces in the crowd were sympathetic, others were carefully blank. A few, the ones who'd always thought a woman living alone in a cottage was slightly improper, looked vindicated. That evening I sat with Thomas in his living room, the ring heavy on my hand. It started a fire against the autumn chill, and the flames threw shadows across the walls that felt like omens. "I could leave the valley," I said, and the words hurt even to speak. "If I go, Geraldine has no case. You keep the farm, the peace, everything." Thomas was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low I had to lean closer to hear. "I spent 43 years with a woman who taught me that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of love in the middle of it. You're not going anywhere, Margaret, not unless you want to. And if Geraldine wants a fight, she'll get one." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed with age. "Anne wrote this for me in case something like this ever happened. I've never shown it to anyone." I unfolded the letter carefully, handling the brittle paper like a relic. Anne's handwriting was precise and elegant, the hand of a woman who'd kept the farm's books for decades. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before she died. In it, she told Thomas that she loved him, that she wanted him to grieve fully but not forever, and that she hoped he would find someone who would walk beside him, not behind him. And then a line that made my throat close. "If that someone is the woman with the basket who comes on Tuesdays, don't let her get away. I've seen her kindness from the window. I've seen the way she doesn't ask for anything. That's a rare thing, Thomas. Hold on to it." I looked up at him, tears finally spilling over. She knew me. She didn't even know my name, but she saw me. Thomas nodded. "Anne saw everyone. It was her gift. And I think in some way we can't understand, she sent you to me." That was the moment the story shifted from a tentative romance to something else entirely. A calling almost, a path that had been prepared even before I knew I was walking it. I realized that my answer on the porch wasn't just about two lonely people finding each other. It was about honoring a woman's final wishes, about stepping into a role that had been prepared for me by forces larger than gossip or legal threats. The days that followed were tense but focused. We hired a lawyer of our own, a young woman named Rebecca Torres who'd grown up in the valley and had no patience for what she called legacy grievances. She reviewed Geraldine's claims and found them flimsy. The ring was personal property, gifted directly to Thomas, not part of the estate. But the medical evaluation request was more dangerous. If a judge ordered it and a biased doctor declared Thomas unfit, everything could unravel. So we gathered character witnesses. Father Michael, the county nurse who'd visited Thomas after Anne's death and found him competent. Even Rosa from the farmer's market who'd seen me bring produce for years. In the middle of the legal maneuvering, an unexpected ally emerged. Mrs. Hattie Kirkland, of all people, called me on the telephone one afternoon and said, without preamble, "I was wrong about you." My herald talked to Geraldine's handyman, who admitted she's been trying to get that ring for years. "She's the opportunist, not you. I'll be telling everyone, and I'll testify if it comes to that." I was so stunned I nearly dropped the phone. Hattie, the town gossip, had become our first public defender. Her change of heart ignited a slow shift in the community. Neighbors who'd been distant started stopping by with real support, a basket of apples, an offer to help with the fall harvest, a quiet word of encouragement. Geraldine's narrative was cracking, but she wasn't finished. Then came the night the barn caught fire. It was the middle of October, unseasonably dry, and I woke at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke. I ran to the window and saw flames licking the side of Thomas's old red barn, the one his father had built. I grabbed the phone and called the volunteer fire department, then pulled on boots and sprinted across the field, the ring bouncing against my chest on the chain where I now wore it for safekeeping. Thomas was already there, outlined against the fire, trying to drag equipment out of the burning building. I shouted his name, and when he turned, his face was a mask of desperation. "The hay," he yelled. "If the hay goes up, the whole field could catch." We worked together in the smoke, hauling out what we could: an antique tractor, a few tools, the wooden trunk that held Anne's quilts. The firefighters arrived with sirens screaming and managed to contain the blaze before it spread to the house, but the barn was a total loss. Standing in the wet, smoking wreckage as the sun came up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold: the charred remains of a gasoline can, deliberately placed near the foundation. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this. And there was only one person in the valley with enough hatred to try. We reported it to the sheriff, but without witnesses there was little he could do. Geraldine had been at a church council meeting across the county that night, an alibi that felt too convenient but couldn't be broken. The fire changed the stakes. It was no longer just about a ring or a reputation. Someone had tried to destroy everything Thomas had built, and by extension, threaten his life. The question now wasn't whether we could weather the legal storm. It was whether we could survive the person behind it. And as I watched Thomas stare at the ashes of his father's barn, I knew that the battle was far from over. It was just beginning to get dangerous. In the days after the fire, the smell of smoke clung to everything. It was in my hair, in Thomas's clothes, in the autumn wind that swept down from the mountains and stirred the blackened timbers where the barn had stood. We walked through the wreckage together on the third morning, picking through the ashes for anything salvageable. The antique tractor was a loss, its wheels melted and its engine block cracked. But the trunk of Anne's quilts had survived, scorched on the outside but intact within, as if something beyond luck had wrapped itself around her handiwork. Thomas pulled out a faded patchwork quilt, the one Anne had made from scraps of their son's baby clothes, and held it to his chest without speaking. The sheriff's investigation was moving slowly. Deputy Marks, a young man with a serious face and a notebook he filled with more questions than answers, interviewed us 3 times. He found footprints at the edge of the property, a partial tire tread from a truck that could have been anyone's, and the remnants of the gasoline can, which had been purchased from the hardware store in town. But the store had sold dozens of identical cans that month, cash transactions, no records. It was the kind of evidence that pointed everywhere and nowhere. Geraldine's alibi held. She'd been at the church council meeting from 7 until 10 with 15 witnesses. But when Deputy Marks mentioned this to me, I caught a flicker of something in his expression, a hesitation that told me he wasn't entirely convinced. It was Rosa, the woman who ran a stall at the farmer's market and had become a quiet friend, who brought the first real break. She came to Thomas's house one afternoon with a man I didn't recognize, a weathered old farmer named Elias Dunn who lived on the far side of the valley. Elias had a piece of information he'd been too scared to share. "I saw a truck on the night of the fire," he said, his voice low and rough. "A blue Ford, older model with a dent in the passenger door. It was parked on the county road near your property line around midnight. I didn't think much of it at the time, but then I heard about the fire. That truck belongs to a man named Roy Pettigrew." Thomas went very still. Roy Pettigrew was Geraldine's handyman, the same man Hattie Kirkland's herald had mentioned, the one who'd admitted Geraldine wanted the ring. We took Elia's statement to Deputy Marks, and for the first time, the investigation had a real direction. Roy was brought in for questioning. He denied everything, of course, claimed he'd been home sleeping. But a neighbor of his, a widow named Clara Bell, told the deputy she'd heard his truck start up around 11:30 that night and return 2 hours later. The timeline didn't match his alibi. Roy was arrested on suspicion of arson, and though he initially refused to talk, the weight of a potential prison sentence eventually loosened his tongue. He admitted to setting the fire, but he insisted he'd acted alone, driven by a personal grudge against Thomas over an old land dispute. He swore Geraldine had nothing to do with it. Nobody believed him, least of all us. But without Roy implicating her directly, Geraldine remained legally untouchable, and rather than retreating, she doubled down. A week after the fire, her lawyer filed a new motion, an emergency petition to have Thomas declared financially incompetent and to freeze his assets pending the outcome of the mental evaluation. The motion claimed that the fire proved Thomas couldn't maintain the property safely, that his judgment was impaired, and that I was exploiting him. The judge denied the emergency order but scheduled a competency hearing for the following month. Geraldine had turned a criminal investigation into a civil proceeding that put Thomas's entire legacy at risk. Here's the thing I didn't understand yet. The ring wasn't Geraldine's true target. It never had been. The ring was just the lever she planned to use to pry the whole farm loose. I learned this from Rebecca Torres, our lawyer, during a late-night meeting at her office. She spread papers across her desk, land records, tax assessments, old survey maps. The Callaway farm sits on 160 acres of prime valley land, she explained. 10 years ago, a developer approached Thomas and Ann about selling for a residential subdivision. They refused. But Geraldine has been trying to change that ever since. She's got ties to a construction company that would pay millions if the land were unlocked. The ring, the competency challenge, the arson, it's all part of a long game to force a sale. If Thomas is declared incompetent, Geraldine can petition to become his legal guardian, and as guardian she can sell the land. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All this time, I thought Geraldine was motivated by grief or greed for a piece of jewelry. But she was playing for the whole valley. The subdivision would bring hundreds of houses, strip malls, traffic, the end of the quiet farmland that had defined Mill Creek for generations. Ann had known this. That's why she'd left the ring to Thomas, why she'd written that letter, why she'd urged him to find someone who would stand beside him. She was protecting more than a marriage. She was protecting a legacy. I took this information to Father Michael, who listened quietly in his study, his hands folded on his desk. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Ann came to me before she died, he said. She told me her sister had been pressuring Thomas to sell for years. Geraldine stands to inherit a portion of the proceeds if the land is sold, through a clause in the family trust Ann's parents established. Ann tried to change the trust before she passed, but the illness moved too fast. She was counting on Thomas to hold the line, and now she's counting on you. He looked at me with a gravity that made my heart pound. You are not just Thomas's future wife, Margaret. You're the guardian of Ann's last stand. That night, I walked across the field under a sky thick with stars, the ring warm on its chain around my neck. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what I'd said yes to. This wasn't just about companionship or even love. I was being asked to become the steward of a dying woman's final wish, to defend a piece of earth that represented everything Geraldine wanted to destroy. I was terrified, but I also felt a strange, fierce purpose rising in me, a courage I didn't know I had. I'd spent years of my life being invisible, staying quiet, avoiding conflict. That version of me was no longer useful. The competency hearing was scheduled for the second week of November, less than 3 weeks away. Rebecca Torres began building our case. We collected affidavits from Father Michael, the county nurse, Rosa, even Hattie Kirkland, all attesting to Thomas's sound mind and good judgment. We subpoenaed the land trust documents that proved Geraldine's financial interest. We found a handwriting expert who verified Ann's letter, but Geraldine had resources we couldn't match. Her lawyer filed motion after motion, delaying depositions and driving up our legal costs. Thomas had savings, but they were finite. The stress began to wear on him in ways I couldn't ignore. One morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. His hands were trembling, not from age, but from exhaustion. "I can't lose this place," he said, his voice cracking. "Anne and I built this life from nothing. Our son is buried on this land under the maple tree. If Geraldine takes it, she'll dig him up and move him to some cemetery she'll never visit. I can't let that happen." I knelt beside his chair and took his shaking hands in mine. "We're not going to let it happen. You're not alone in this anymore." He looked at me, and for the first time since the fire, I saw a glimmer of hope return to his eyes. But then came the day Geraldine played her trump card. Rebecca called us to her office with a pale face. She had a thick envelope from Geraldine's lawyer, and inside was a sworn statement from a doctor at the county medical center, claiming that Thomas had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 6 months prior. The doctor, a man named Harold Finch, was someone I'd never heard of, and Thomas insisted he'd never been examined by anyone with that name. But the statement was notarized and accompanied by what appeared to be medical records. It was a forgery, but it was a professional one, and it would take time. We didn't have to discredit it in court. "I've seen this before," Rebecca said, her voice tight. "They're trying to create a cloud of doubt big enough to make the judge order an independent evaluation. If the evaluation is done by a doctor friendly to Geraldine, they can manufacture a diagnosis. Once that diagnosis is on record, overturning it is almost impossible." She paused, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. "There's one other thing. The statement also claims that Thomas has been giving away valuable property under the influence of an opportunistic companion. It specifically names the ring and suggests criminal elder abuse. The allegation of elder abuse was a new, darker turn. If Geraldine could convince the authorities that I was exploiting Thomas, I could face charges. We were no longer just fighting for the farm. We were fighting for our freedom." The sheriff, who had been sympathetic, was now obligated to open an investigation into the abuse claim. I was questioned separately from Thomas, asked to account for every gift, every meal, every moment I'd spent in his house. It was humiliating and terrifying, and it clarified something for me. Geraldine wasn't just ruthless. She was willing to destroy my life completely to get what she wanted. In the middle of this crisis, an unexpected gift arrived. It was a package left on my doorstep with no return address. Inside was a small cardboard box and a handwritten note. The note said, "The truth is buried in the trust. Look at the original, not the copy." It was signed simply, "A friend." The box contained a key and the address of a storage unit in the next county. I showed it to Rebecca, who immediately recognized the storage unit as belonging to the late family lawyer who had drafted the original trust documents. The lawyer had died 2 years ago, and his estate had been in probate, his records sealed. But if there was an original trust document that differed from the version Geraldine had been using, it could rewrite the entire legal battle. We drove to the storage unit that same afternoon. The key fit. Inside, amid dusty file boxes, we found a metal cabinet containing the lawyer's archived records. It took hours of searching, but eventually Rebecca pulled out a folder labeled Holbrook Family Trust Original. Her hands were trembling as she opened it. The document inside was dated 20 years prior, signed by Anne's parents. It clearly stated that in the event of Anne's death, the trust assets, including the land, would pass entirely to Thomas Calloway, with no provision for Geraldine beyond a small cash bequest that had already been paid. The version Geraldine had been using was a fraudulent amendment, never properly witnessed or notarized. The real document made Geraldine a beneficiary of nothing. This was the pivot. Everything Geraldine had been fighting for was built on a lie she had manufactured. She had no legal right to the land, no standing to contest Thomas's competency, no claim to the ring. The original document, if authenticated, would collapse her entire case and expose her as a forger. Rebecca immediately filed an emergency motion to dismiss the competency hearing and introduce the new evidence. The judge, a reasonable woman named Judith Hartley, granted an expedited review. The day of the hearing arrived cold and clear, the mountains sharp against a pale sky. The courthouse was packed with people from the valley, a silent army that had come to witness. Geraldine sat at the front with her lawyers, her expression confident but tight. Thomas and I sat together in the first row, the ring on my finger now where it belonged. And when Judge Hartley entered, the room fell so silent you could hear the old building settling. Everything we had fought for, everything Anne had protected, came down to what would happen in the next hour. When the gavel struck the bench, the sound echoed through that courtroom like a door slamming shut on everything Geraldine had built her life around. Judge Hartley did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply read the ruling in a clear, deliberate tone that left no room for appeal. The original trust document was valid. Geraldine's version was a forgery. The competency petition was dismissed with prejudice. The ring was mine to wear not by permission but by right. And as for the elder abuse charge, the judge called it a malicious fiction intended to harass an innocent woman. I heard Rosa let out a sob behind me. I heard Hattie Kirkland whisper, "Well, that's that." And then I felt Thomas take my hand, his grip warm and steady, and I knew we had crossed the last dark mile together. Geraldine left the courthouse through a side door, her lawyers trailing her like stray dogs. I never spoke to her again. I heard later that she moved to Florida, still insisting she'd been cheated, still hanging her bitterness on the same tired hook of old grievances. But here in the valley, her name faded like a bad dream at sunrise. The land remained. The fields kept growing. The mountains never moved, and Thomas and I began the quiet work of building a life that was no longer under siege. I moved into the old white farmhouse 2 weeks after the hearing, carrying my few belongings across the field that had become the map of my heart. Father Michael insisted on a proper wedding, not because we needed a piece of paper, we already had the ring and the promise, but because he said the community needed to witness something good after so much ugliness. So on a Saturday in late November, with the cottonwoods bare and the air crisp as a fresh apple, we stood at the front of the little white chapel. Rosa was there. Hattie was there, wearing a hat that could have shaded a small village. Deputy Marks came in his dress uniform. Even Elias Dunn, the old farmer who'd broken the case, shuffled to a pew in the back. And when Father Michael asked if anyone had reason to object, the silence was so full and complete it felt like a blessing spoken aloud. The ring didn't look like much to an outsider. It was a thin gold band, worn smooth by decades, unadorned. But when Thomas slid it onto my finger, the same finger it already knew, now officially, publicly, permanently, I felt the weight of 3 years of Tuesdays, 150 walks across a field, 1,000 words never spoken but understood. Anne was there too, in a way I can't explain. Not as a ghost or a shadow, but as a quiet permission, a final gift from a woman who had taught me that love doesn't divide, it multiplies. Now when I walk across the field, it's not with a covered dish but with a pair of clippers for the garden or a thermos of coffee for a shared lunch. Thomas still sits on the porch most mornings, and I sit beside him. Sometimes we talk about Anne, or about my mother, or about the son he lost. Sometimes we just watch the light change on the mountains. The barn was rebuilt by a crew of neighbors who showed up with lumber and hammers 3 months after the fire, led by Sebastian's nephew, a young man who said he wanted to be part of something that mattered. There's a new plaque on the door, built by many hands, held by one heart. It's a little sentimental maybe, but it's true. At the farmer's market, I run a stall with Rosa, selling vegetables from the garden and pies made from Anne's old recipes. People come from miles around now, not just for the food, but for the story. They've heard about the fire, the court case, the ring. They want to touch something that survived. And I tell them if they ask that the recipe isn't the secret. The secret is showing up week after week without expectation. The secret is the field itself, the willingness to cross it. If there is a lesson in all of this, it's that second chances rarely look like we imagine. They don't arrive as grand gestures or dramatic rescues. They come as ordinary Tuesdays, as hot meals in steady hands, as a worn gold ring offered without guarantee. The world tells us to guard our hearts, to wait for perfect conditions, to fear the judgment of others. But I've learned that the only thing more terrifying than risking love is reaching the end of your life and realizing you never did. As I sit on this porch now, with Thomas beside me and the autumn light painting the mountains gold, I think about the woman I was before I crossed that field the first time. She was lonely without admitting it. She was safe without being alive. She needed someone to need her, and she needed the courage to be needed in return. That woman is still here, but she's been joined by another one. A woman who wears a worn ring and knows that home isn't a place you find. It's a place you build, one Tuesday at a time. If this story has reminded you of something you've nearly forgotten, that it's never too late, that small kindnesses can become great loves, that the very thing you're afraid to reach for might be reaching back for you, then please consider subscribing. There are more stories like ours, quiet ones that don't always make the headlines, and we want to keep telling them. Share this with someone who might need to hear that a new chapter is still possible, because it is. The field is waiting. The door is open. All you have to do is walk across.